The issue is that I typically see folks just trying to use AI. They know they should use AI, but they are not tying it to some type of goal or process that they're already doing. They're either trying to create new problems that they think is a problem versus actually just look at your different processes and what you're already doing and try to think about how can AI augment this? How can AI help us get to this solution faster and quicker?
You're listening to HR Superstars, a podcast brought to you by 15Five. On this show, we talk to strategic people leaders who are making a meaningful impact in their organizations and shaping the future of work. So get ready to be inspired and discover the secrets behind building high-performing teams and fostering a culture of growth and thriving. The future of HR starts here. Hi, everyone. It's Karina Young, VP of People here at 15Five. We just held Thrive 2025, our annual brand event, and it was an amazing time. During Thrive, we hosted a session that really stood out to me, and I think it'll resonate with every HR leader listening. It's called Intelligent AI Starts with Quality Data, and it dives into what it really takes to prepare your people data so AI can work for you, not against you. We all know how AI is reshaping the way we work, but what I loved about this conversation is that it gets really practical about the basics of AI and why data is so important. AI isn't magic, it's a multiplier. So when your data is clean and connected, it actually helps you make smarter, faster decisions. When it's not, it just amplifies the mess you have at hand. In this session, our own Anthony Onesto talked to Nelson Spencer, the founder of efora.io, an AI consulting firm that helps organizations integrate AI into the way they work. Nelson's focus is on making AI practical, responsible, and aligned with how people actually get work done. His career spans analytics and technologies, from professional sports to leadership roles at companies like Figma, Sonos, and Wayfair. Nelson now advises AI and HR tech startups as a venture partner and brings a thoughtful, real-world perspective on how data and AI can elevate HR. I found this session really inspiring and useful, and I want to bring it here for our HR Superstars community. So let's get into it.
I'm Anthony Onesto, as KP said, VP of Platform and Product Marketing here at 15Five. I spent a lot of time exploring how AI affects our work and how HR leaders can engage in a way that moves all of us forward. I have the honor today of talking with Nelson Spencer about what HR leaders need to do today to prepare their data for tomorrow's AI. His focus is on making AI practical, responsible, and aligned with how people actually get work done. Thanks for joining us, Nelson. Good to see you.
Likewise, Anthony, I appreciate the opportunity. Excited to be here.
For those of us who aren't technical, I wouldn't say I'm technical by any means, can you explain in simple terms, what is a large language model? You'll probably hear this as LLM in some cases. And how does it actually work?
When I think about a large language model, I think about it essentially, it's a very kind of complex, but also very formal, like autocomplete. So if you think about when you're on Google search, for example, and you're searching for something, it will, suggest what you are trying to predict and search for. So instead of it searching based on like what other people have searched for before, an LLM does the same kind of idea to very large scale, but it's for basically all of the internet. So if you think about when you are communicating with AI or ChatGPT or whatever model you're using, when it's generating text back, it's essentially trying to do an autocomplete based on all of the data across like the internet. It's very good at recognizing patterns. Getting into the weeds, it's more on like probability and statistics, but it's basically just being able to understand based off of all of the text that it essentially exists on the internet. Here's what most likely you are talking about and looking for. So it's really just a very robust kind of autocomplete.
I love the simplicity of your answer because you don't necessarily have to be that technical to really utilize AI and get familiar with it.
No, definitely not.
Okay, so now that we have a baseline of what an LLM or a large language model does and how it works, there's a lot of discussion around quality of data. And I want to shout out to Yen, part of the 15Five team, who's constantly thinking of data quality. Why does the quality of data matter so much and how well an AI actually performs?
Yeah, absolutely. So going back to the example of what an LLM is. So when I say it's trained on all of the internet. That's essentially the data. So like this is training data. So the importance of the data and the quality is because that's what leads to like the output. So when we say like you have an LLM or you have a platform that sits on top of your data, like your HR data, it's basically just generating text and insights based off the data that it's trained on, which essentially is that underlying data. So that's why it needs to be clean, non-biased, things like that, because it's just generating based on like the inputs that it's given. So that's why we always talk about garbage in, garbage out, because it's not kind of doing this like magical process of like cleaning all of your data and things like that. It's really just amplifying what you already have and what it's been trained on. So that's really the important part of why you want to have a really good hygiene for your data, clean it and all that kind of stuff. Because again, it's just like the output is just generating from the input is your underlying data infrastructure.
Yeah, that makes complete sense. And there's definitely a lot of discussion around garbage in or garbage out. I think go or something, whatever the acronym is. We have acronyms for everything these days. So really important, especially as we think about people data, right? Not only what the AI or the LLMs that we're used to now trained on, but even thinking about your own people data, super important. I just want to side, I know you talked about autocomplete in your answer around LLMs. Can you just define that for folks?
It's really just trying to predict the next word that's in line that makes the most sense. And it's all based on probability. So if I say my favorite color is, the LLM is most likely going to say something like, it's going to pick a color, right? It's going to pick blue, green. It's not going to say my favorite color is house, because most people don't say that like on the underlying data and infrastructure, if that makes sense. So it's not that it knows my favorite color is house doesn't actually make logical sense. So I think this is an important point about like how LLMs work. They don't have like logic or thinking like we do. It's just based on patterns, because people have not said on the internet, my favorite color is house at a huge scale, that is not likely going to pick that. But it would say my favorite color is blue or red or whatever it may be. So it's just probability of like what is the most likely next word. So it's just doing that at a very large scale when it's generating your responses.
Appreciate that. All right. So we understand what an LLM is to a degree now. We understand the quality of data. You talk a lot about centralizing your data into a warehouse.
Yep.
We're not talking about the warehouse where, we have garments and other things. You're talking about a very different warehouse, a data warehouse. Can you talk about what is a data warehouse for our folks?
Yeah, absolutely. So let's take a look at like the HR tech stack in general, right? So you typically have a few different core tools, right? So 15.5, for example, you might have all of your performance, you have all your surveys in there. Then you probably have an ATS that has all of your recruiting data and all those different things, right? So we have a lot of different tools across your tech stack. All of those tools have a lot of data in them, right? So like you're going into your ATS to pull out metrics, et cetera, et cetera. The point of a data warehouse essentially is to aggregate all of that data across your tools into one place so that you are able to really tell robust stories and connect the dots across your different systems versus just looking at one system in particular. So a lot of folks, when they don't have kind of a mature data engineering or warehouse kind of set up, essentially you are typically kind of going into each tool to pull out your insights. So that is the idea of a data warehouse, is being able to aggregate all of that data and clean it and organize it across all of your different systems so that you can better, tell stories and look at the insights and things like that.
In most of my career, so prior to becoming VP of platform and product marketing here, I was a chief people officer. I spent my entire career. It has been rare, if ever, to get everything in one place, ever. Like to be able to even cross-section data. So as we think about this future in AI, how important is a data warehouse? Is it a critical thing for folks to be thinking about? Should they be talking to their vendors or their tools? How are you thinking about that, or at least advising? Because I know you do a lot of advising in this.
Absolutely. So I think it's still very important. I think the technical components of like how it runs and how it's set up will probably be augmented with AI, just because the work to move data, like data engineering from one tool to another, will probably be simplified just because of how LLMs are very good at processing large amounts of information. But underlying the same point still applies, essentially, is that you still want to have your data in one place, ideally, to just have it, clean and things like that. But I will say there will be more of an emphasis on, what you can do with data continuing. That's because the back end technical infrastructure will be, with any kind of advancement, it will be much better, faster, things like that. So I think it's
Right.
still important to know what a data warehouse is and have a really good understanding of like where all the different data comes from, that when you're having, your tools sit on top of it. But the underlying technical components of the data warehouse will probably change thanks to AI in like in a good, helpful way. So it'll probably be a lot more automated, probably less reliance on like heavy data engineering capability, but the core components is still very important.
So data warehouse aside, LLMs, AI, the idea here is everything in one place,
Yes.
in essence. So, what do you see as the advantages? You've been in people analytics, you've been in analytics, like the advantages you see to having everything in one place, or a piece of everything in one place, if you will. What are the disadvantages or the issues, or, when HR folks are just like keeping these systems siloed in that way?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's easier to start on like the disadvantages because I think they're not necessarily as obvious all the time to folks. When I think about the disadvantages, I think of three things. So one, I think of it's really fragmented decision making, right? So like if you are trying to answer a question and you're only having to go into each individual tool, you're limited by what is the data in that specific tool. And then that kind of can limit the amounts of like questions that you can really answer. And then that leads to the second part is the productivity drain of having to, we all are familiar with like having to go into this tool, export the CSV, put it into, Excel, pull in another data export from a different tool, do some pivot tables, try and clean the data, try and find some insights across it. So that just takes a lot of time and is not a really great use of time across your team and things like that. And sometimes that requires more technical skill sets and things like that. So it's also just very like inefficient when you're trying to like understand kind of like what do we have. You're spending more time aggregating the data than getting into the data, understanding like the insights and telling a story. So I think that's important. And then I think the last part of the disadvantages is like you're really kind of missing the strategic opportunities, because if you think about HR is very natural kind of like reactive state, right? So like a lot of times we're telling stories about what just happened. So like what was turnover the last quarter or the last year. When you start to have all of your data included in one spot, you get really proactive and get more strategic on kind of like what can we do into the future. So like that's kind of a segue into the pros of having it all together, right? Is that you're saving a lot less time on aggregating data and really a lot more time on the big picture stuff that you want to be spending time on. So you want to be spending more time on really kind of answering the why behind why is something happening. And the more data that you have in one spot, the easier it is to keep getting deeper versus saying like, I have this question, but I don't know where the data is. I don't know how to like jump into that tool and things like that. So it all kind of makes it much easier to just like be able to tell comprehensive, robust stories when it's all in one place.
Makes complete sense. See, almost too much effort where you would rather it be effortless around getting the insights you need to start impacting the business.
Tired of high turnover costs draining your resources? 15.5's performance management platform helps you find and act on employee turnover risk before it's too late. From continuous feedback loops to manager coaching and training that improves role clarity, recognition, and retention. Learn more at 15.5.com or click the link in the show notes.
When we think about AI in HR, what is the biggest mistake HR teams make when they jump into AI specifically?
This is probably not just an HR related problem. I think this is kind of really organizational problems in general. The issue is that I typically see folks just trying to, they want to use AI, they know they should use AI, but they are not tying it to some type of goal or process that they're already doing. So when I think about AI, I really kind of think about it. You mentioned like being a force multiplier and really augmenting like what you're already doing. So I think the challenge that folks have is that they don't use AI to connect to their end goals that they already have. They're either trying to create new problems that they think is a problem versus like actually just look at your different processes and what you're already doing and try to think about how can AI augment this? How can AI help us get to this solution faster and quicker versus trying to think of all of these new potentially innovative ways to use AI, start with just trying to solve the problems that you already have right now and use AI in that way. So I think the challenge that folks don't think about or kind of connect to is really tying it to like your current goals and your current processes already and just starting there.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, I think some of the things that I've been talking a lot about with HR leaders is something that we've been doing for forever in HR is task analysis. So we used to do it years ago where it's like, hey, put in everything that you do, as simple as an Excel spreadsheet. And years ago it was, can this thing be outsourced in some way? And now we're thinking of it more of automated. Can this be automated, whether through AI tools? And these agents are just getting better and better. But there is a proliferation of the idea that these things could be done for full jobs. And that's not true, right? The idea that it's really task level type of automation versus full job automation. We're not there and we're not going to be there for quite a while, but I love that thought.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to hit on that real quick, a lot of what I would recommend folks to do that they don't typically spend a lot of time on is what you're talking about, like process mapping. So especially when you're thinking about something like an automation, because automations are really great for, specific workflows, right? So it's like, this happens, then this happens, then this happens. We all kind of know these big workflows that we do, but we don't typically have them well documented. So I think that's really important, especially if you want to, find easy ways to get into automation and things like that.
When we think about centralizing or bringing all these elements together, your HRIS data, your survey data, your review data, why has that been so difficult? Pulling data in from all these systems, getting it to, like what has been the barrier there? Why has it been so hard when HR watches other departments and it kind of seems to be easier there? Maybe not. Maybe I'm wrong.
I think there's a few levels to it in layers. So I think one is the end product. So like when you have a product or engineering team, inherently as part of that, the output is very concrete. You have to have all of your inputs and outputs together. I think HR is obviously a little bit different, right? Because it's not like we have this one concrete product that we are giving out. So I think that naturally has challenges for like your infrastructure. What we see often is that you start with one tool and then you're just quickly scaling, right? So like you start with an ATS, then I have to have an HRIS, then I have to have an LMS, then I have to have surveys. Then you have 15 tools and then they all talk to each other. They're all kind of all over the place. So I think it's just like naturally as part of how we work and how HR functions is that it's easy to just like have a lot of like bloat in a sense of like how many tools you have. But so that's like one side. I think the other side that makes it hard to like actually aggregate your data is a lot of those tools were not necessarily meant to connect directly to other tools. A lot of tools want you to kind of live in their ecosystem. So when you start to get into the weeds of pulling out the data from, your ATS and trying to join it to like your HRIS, you have to think about things like, this is like candidate data, and then do they become an employee data? And then they have like employee IDs, candidate IDs, and the different levels of the underlying structure of each platform is very different depending on like what it does and like what data looks like. So that's why it kind of makes it a challenge. So I think it's not only just the nature of HR in general, but also the data can be complex depending on like which tools you're trying to aggregate together. And then I think the last part that we don't talk enough about is just the productivity drain, is like the time and resources. You have to kind of like stop or dedicate enough resources to put that all together. And obviously that's typically hard in HR because we're putting out fires and we're trying to, keep the lights on and things like that. So
Right.
A combination of a lot of different things, I think makes it particularly challenging for HR.
Yeah, really, really interesting. And I got a ton of sort of my 20 years of trying to do this in your discussion. I was starting to sweat. I don't know if people can see that. But all right. So now let's assume you have clean data, you have connected data, you have your Nirvana, you have your data warehouse, or you have a solution like 15.5. How are you thinking about now when we overlay? One of the things that I get really excited is the predictive models, right? The AI guidance. Like, how are these things move HR from reporting, just sort of giving lagging indicators, to really kind of shaping the future, getting ahead of things? How are you seeing this?
In terms of just like predictive analytics, so typically it is you are making predictions based off of past data. So that is the underlying point of why the data quality and putting it all in one place makes that whole process much smoother and easier. So when you want to predict into the future, you are typically using that past historical data. So the goal is to really understand, like, how can we be more proactive and start to understand what we anticipate happening based on what has happened in the past. So lots of examples. A lot of people think about predicting turnover or attrition or things like that. But you can also think about things like workforce planning or recruiter capacity and understanding, like, what is the capacity that we need for this time of year if we have like a lot of roles that we hire in this specific window, things like that. So ideally you have all of that data that you have already kind of seen, and you have the data that's actually happened. Predictive analytics allows you to do that quicker, especially with AI, to understand kind of like what are the correlations between what we've seen happened, how can we start to put that into a model and predict what we think will happen into the future.
Yeah, and it's a very cool piece where, a lot of reporting that we do today in HR is very lagging indicator reporting, which I think is super important. And more of that is getting a focus. And I think more of it needs to be a focus. But the idea of being able to be predictive and intervene at the point where you can fix what the future looks like. And I'm not talking about this in a Marvel Avengers kind of fix the future, but that kind of thing where you can actually impact and have the business impact there. I know we're coming about time here, and it's been a great session, Nelson. Really, really awesome. So for the HR leader that feels behind, really, really quickly, what's the first step they should take to start down this journey?
Yeah, absolutely. So I mentioned one, I think, like taking a look at like what are your processes right now. So like spending some time on documentation, because that will be a huge driver into automation, productivity, things like that. And especially like if you kind of get into the agents, that still kind of relies on like what is the process that's happening. So I think doing that. And then I think, as I mentioned, really trying to align on like what are your key goals. So most organizations already have goals or KPIs or OKRs, whatever it looks like for your organization. Really trying to understand kind of like, if the output is the goal or OKR, what are the inputs that go into that? And then keep breaking that down and putting different systems in, like, what is the system that creates this data point and how do we track that? So like get very deep into the weeds on like all of your processes and trying to understand, like connect them to your goals. And then you'll have a very clear picture of like, oh, here's where I think we should spend our time for AI to save our recruiters 2 hours a week on this versus this, et cetera, et cetera. So just being able to have a very clear picture of what is happening across your different departments, I think that's a really foundational place that most people skip. They want to get into the fun stuff, but the fun stuff really kind of comes from doing the boring stuff really well.
I love that. I love that last part. I think it's really critical for folks to hear that there are some basic elements that you don't have to dive completely into the advanced AI to be really effective. Thanks again, Nelson, for sharing your expertise with us today. I think the biggest takeaway for me from the session is that AI doesn't fix bad data. It just amplifies it, right? So you got to start with strong foundations. You unlock AI's ability to multiply your impact on performance, engagement, retention, like you talked about. So what we would love to encourage folks to ask is, what's one step we can take right now to improve our data foundations? Because that is the first step, as Nelson said, toward making AI truly impactful at your business. Thank you, Nelson, very much. Thanks, everyone, for joining us.
As an HR leader, you have a critical role in managing an organization's most valuable asset, its people. However, despite the importance of your role, other executives may not see the value of having HR leaders at the executive table. This is why we crafted the HR Outcomes Playbook. It's designed to help you close that gap and operate in a way that enlightens and excites the rest of the executive team and shows them that HR can provide value to an organization's bottom line. Get your copy at the link in the show notes now.